the ability to take pain. So as I was saying before, this is about emotional resilience. So let's go back to Bill Miller. So think about what Bill Miller went through during the financial crisis. He had recently gone through a divorce, which he said to me, it was an amicable divorce, but it halved his assets. He then invests his half of the assets on margin because he is always kind of a bit of a risk taker. He loses 80% on paper of his assets in the financial crisis, whereas he said to me his wife put all her money in bonds and did fantastically and outperformed him massively and now has like the biggest house in Greenwich, Connecticut. And so he's done well since then, so he's recovered. But his two funds get really hammered, and assets just fly out of the window. I mean, at his peak at Legg Mason, he was overseeing $77 billion. Assets go down to 800 million. And when this happens, he has to lay off tons of people. And so he ends up laying off over 100 people. And he said to me, you know, this was the worst thing. He said, people lost their money, investors lost their money, and people lost their jobs because of me, because of mistakes that I made. And I said to him, did you blame yourself? And he said, sure as hell I blamed myself. He said, I looked around, I wanted to blame someone else. There was no one else to blame. They were my mistakes. And during this period, he told me that he put on 40 pounds. And I said to him, you know, how come you put on 40 pounds? And you know, dietary issues are important to me because I'm always wondering how I can ever lose weight. And so I was interested in his answer. And he said, well, I ate a lot of comfort food. I ate a lot of cheeseburgers. I ate a lot of Chinese food. I would drink red wine at night. And he said, you know, I could have come home and just had grilled salmon and broccoli and Perrier. But he said, a man can only take so much pain. So Miller said to me at one point that if you did a brain scan of the greatest value investors, he said he's pretty convinced that you would find that the greatest value investors are actually wired differently than the rest of us, that they have, that the part of the brain that processes, say, the fear of loss or the pain of loss is actually kind of stunted in them. And I think you can see this in people like Buffett, that they're extremely unemotional. You see it in Marx as well. And yet, Miller, during this period of very tremendous intensity, gets hit badly enough that he puts on 40 pounds and it becomes this incredibly intense experience. And I think this is a powerful reminder that you really need to pay attention. If you want to be long-term successful as an investor, you need to pay attention to the need to build emotional resilience. And this is a really important point that I think particularly people forget when we're going through a good period. You tend to assume things will always be good. And you tend to overreach during these good periods. You know, we get full of overconfidence and hubris. And I think it's really key to remember one of the things that Howard Marks says, which is that life is basically a pendulum, that our own lives are a pendulum. They swing one way from one extreme to the other, that the market is a pendulum, that market euphoria is a pendulum. And so just not to get carried away during these periods where everything is good. You don't want to overreach. You want to work on the basis that there is going to be a time where I'm going to get hit. And this isn't to be gloomy about it. It's just you want to take various safeguards, like various precautions. You don't want to overreach. You know, Bill Ruane once said to me, you just never want to invest in margin because when the market gets hit, it's just impossible to be rational because it's such an emotionally grueling thing. So I think this sense of taking great caution during the periods where things are good is a key to setting yourself up to be able to dealing with pain. But I think also it's really important to look at where different investors get their emotional strength and to ask yourself, so where will I get my strength when things go wrong? And so it was very striking to me, for example, that Miller, when I asked him what he was reading during the financial crisis, he said basically I was reading the Stoic philosophers. So he was reading Epictetus and Seneca, because what they're talking about is as he described it to me, he said it's their general attitude to misfortune. It's that they're saying you can't necessarily control what happens to you, but you can control your attitude towards it. And this is a very, very important idea. And when I look at all of these great investors, it's very tempting to assume, you know, that there was this straight upward trajectory and their lives were always going to be a success. And it's really not true at all. You know, these guys, all of them went through the ringer. And you know, you look at people like Everard, John Everard, or Donald Yackman, they went through periods in the late 90s where they looked like idiots because they refused to buy expensive stocks. They underperformed for years. You know, Everard said to me, you know, when you underperform massively for 3 years, he said the first year your shareholders are upset, the second year they're furious, and the third year they're gone. And he said at a certain point you start to say, am I an idiot? You know, how come I don't get it? How come everyone else gets it? So you know, while we're talking about the willingness to be lonely, the willingness to go your own direction, it's important to understand that this requires a degree of strength. It requires emotional fortitude. But I would say, for all of you, you're going to find that in the course of a lifetime, there are periods that are very intense, and you need to figure out, where am I going to get my emotional strength? And it doesn't necessarily matter whether it's from Stoic philosophy, whether it's from spirituality, which it was for someone like Don Yackman, who was actually he was an archbishop in the Mormon Church at one point, and he said to me that a period like the late 90s, he said if it hadn't been for his faith, his family, he's been married for I think 50 years and has 7 kids and 25 grandkids. If it hadn't been for his faith, his family, and the fact that he volunteered in things like the Scouts, he said a period like that could have destroyed me. And this was his language. He was like, it could have destroyed me. And so I think, you know, this is a very important idea. Like, where am I going to get my emotional strength?
So you're talking about you suggest to diverge from the cross. I think the people follow the cross for reasons because it's safer, it's less risky. So what's your take on this point? If you want to be lonely, take more to be diverse, but probably be more risky.
So how to think through this idea of how diversified you should be to control risk?
Yeah, versus taking a risk, right? This is like a trade-off there.
Yeah, I think you've focused on really one of the most important questions. And one of the things that was fascinating to me in terms of interviewing an array of these different great investors was actually to see the difference in the way that they had solved this question. So Monish, for example, had most of his money in about 5 stocks and had tremendous confidence, tremendous knowledge of these stocks. But then one of them blew up. And you know, so it's risky. You know, I mean, there's I think it's one reason why Monish will outperform massively over the years, but I think it can be like that. And so for Monish, because he has this extraordinary temperament, it's feasible. So I said to Monish about the financial crisis, I said, how did you deal with the stress of the financial crisis? Because at one point his hedge fund was massively down. And he said, oh, I don't feel stress. And I actually don't think that's true. I think it may have been true then, but I think there are circumstances where even for Monish or even for like Bill Miller, these guys who are very unemotional, you can get to a situation where a sufficient number of things go wrong that actually it becomes very painful. And so I think even for people like Monish, who have an extraordinary temperament, you have to be aware of the dangers of overconfidence. And I talked to people like Joel Greenblatt about this, and Joel had 80%. Joel is one of the greatest hedge fund managers of all time, and Joel had 80% of his money in 6 to 8 stocks for much of his career, and he said, you know, every few weeks the portfolio might go down, 30% in a couple of weeks, and he said it was fine for him. He could cope with it, but he said he actually returned a lot of the shareholders' money. After 5 years, he returned half the money, and after 10 years, he returned all of the money. So the only shareholders were him and his family and his partners. And he said if the family lost money or friends lost money, he would help them out, and so it was okay. So I think the point is, you kind of have to look at your own temperament and say, how unemotional am I? And one of the things my friend Guy Spear was saying to me recently is you can actually get to a point where you're emotionally flooded, where you can actually reach a point where a sufficient number of things go wrong at the same time that it's very hard to be rational, to make rational decisions. And his view is that you want to try always to be the last man standing. And he said you look at Buffett, who has 10 times more capital in his insurance business than anyone else. He's basically set it up so he's anti-fragile, so he'll survive whatever goes wrong. And And so Guy's view is you want to kind of look at what everyone else is doing, what the people you do, what the people you really admire, where they are on the risk curve, and then he said just do less than them. And I think it's a really interesting idea that you kind of, yeah, if you're super concentrated, if you're incredibly smart, you can get unbelievable returns. But I think for most of us, if you want to survive over not one cycle, but 20, 30, 40, 50 years as an investor, I think diversification and just saying, what do I know? What if it goes wrong? What if I'm wrong? There's a French investor I interviewed, a guy called François-Marie Wojcik, who said to me, I have 3 principles: doubt, doubt, and doubt. And I think it's kind of helpful to doubt yourself. And I think diversification, it's just kind of rational to say, yeah, but if this company I own, if I'm wrong, what are the consequences? And one of the things Irving Kahn said to me that I thought was really interesting. He said the single most important piece of financial advice I can share is to focus on the downside. And he said, the trouble these days, he said, people can gallop really fast, but he said they don't really know what direction they're galloping in. And he said, if you really focus on the downside, and he said you have reasonable returns and you avoid terrible losses, he said you'll outperform all of your gambler friends. And he said it's also a good cure for your sleeping problems.